All right. Andrew and I are back in action and ready to continue our critical look at Jordan Peterson's best-selling book, We Who Wrestle with God. In the last episode, we made some introductory comments about Peterson and his overall project in this work, and we also critically summarized the foreshadowing chapter. In this episode, we're going to critically reflect on the first two chapters of this book, and we'll break this episode down into two parts. First, I'll briefly outline and critically summarize the material in chapter 1, and then I'll turn it to Andrew, who will outline and critically summarize the material in chapter 2. Now, these two chapters cover a ton of material. We're talking 86 pages worth. So we are obviously going to have to be extremely selective in what we focus on. Inevitably, we'll be leaving out a lot in our discussion, but hopefully we'll talk around the main things, or at least the things that are most interesting to us. All right, let's turn our attention to chapter 1. Get right into it. Let's begin with an outline. So chapter 1 is titled In the Beginning, and this chapter is primarily interested in the creation account in Genesis chapter 1. And the chapter is broken down into 5 subsections. The first section is what Jordan titles God as Creative Spirit. And here he explores the character of God as he finds it in Genesis 1, as well as the meaning of man and woman in the image of God. Then the second section he titles The Spirit of Man in the Highest Place. And here he considers the divine prerogative and responsibility had by humans as image bearers of the divine. And here he's going to get into subduing and naming and creating and so forth. In the third section, which he titles The Real and Its Representation, he presents a somewhat dense, quasi-philosophical section here, where the implications of the previous two sections are kind of fleshed out. And then he focuses in on what he sees to be the creative structuring of the intelligible world by human consciousness. So we'll have something to say about that for sure. In the fourth section, which he titles Eve from Adam, this is basically an exploration of the significance of Eve being created from Adam, and this is a shorter section. And then finally, he ends with a section called In God's Image. And here he just kind of brings together all of the insights that he has made in the chapter, and then he ends with a further reflection on what it means for humanity to be in the image of God. All right, that's the outline. So let's move to my critical assessment. All right, the first thing to say here is this is by no means a straightforward interpretation or exegesis of Genesis chapter 1. Peterson is not applying the grammatical historical method here. He's not trying to understand the text in its context. Rather, what he's doing is he's giving us a Jungian analysis of the biblical creation account. And if you're wondering what that means, you need to go back and watch the previous introductory episode in this series where we explain the heavy influence of the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung's analytical psychology on Peterson's thinking. All right, so chapter 1 covers a lot of ground. I'm going to focus my thoughts on Peterson's perceptions of the divine, which is, of course, the book's subtitle, that he kind of draws out of the creation account. He also has some philosophically noteworthy things to say about the nature of the true and the nature of the real that I want us to briefly reflect on. And finally, I'd like to say something about Peterson's interaction with aspects of the thought of both Freud and Nietzsche in this chapter that I think is pretty interesting. All right, so let me start with my critical analysis of the perception of the divine that Peterson draws from the creation account in Genesis. As we noted last time, this is what the book is really about. This is what Peterson is really interested in doing, in delivering with this book, because he wants to give us a certain perception of the divine. And in the last episode, we looked at the foreshadowing chapter, and there I raised the doubt that Peterson has any room for a transcendent God, or a God who is ontologically other, a being who is in some sense separate and distinct from his creation, a being who brings creation into existence from nothing. And I'm sorry to report that after these first two chapters, reading them, thinking about them, this doubt that I have has not been disabused. It's still there. I still think that Peterson lacks any conception of a transcendently distinct God. All right, so I see Peterson making two primary moves in this chapter. The first move that he makes is to functionalize God, or to functionalize the divine. The second move that he makes is then to psychologize God, or to psychologize the divine. So what do I mean when I say that Peterson functionalizes God? Well, Peterson characterizes God in a wholly functional way, as opposed to an ontological or metaphysical way, or even as opposed to a theological or even a personal way. Peterson thinks that the Bible is giving us especially in Genesis 1, is giving us a characterization of God as a spirit, which for Peterson, this means to signify that God, what God really is a process or an activity that fulfills a kind of function. So he's going to deploy functional terms to describe God. He describes God as the confronter of chaos, for example, or as upward striving, or as upward development, or as ethical striving, as voluntary sacrifice, as the engenderer of the real, as the spirit that leads to what is highest. This is a quote from page 5. Peterson says, God is presented as the process or spirit guided by the aim of having all that exists flourish, the spirit guided by love. Again, this is not the classical or historical or biblical view of God, whereas the classical Christian view of God is that of a transcendent divine being, a kind of person, to be worshipped. Peterson's view of God seems to me to be that of an immanent and universal divine process, not to be worshipped, but to be aligned with. Okay, that's what I see is what's happening here. And what do I mean by the psychologization of God? What do I mean that Peterson psychologizes God? Well, Peterson's going to identify God or the divine as an aspect of the universal, abstract human psyche. Again, we talked about this Jungian idea in the last episode. God is described as the process of the deep, shared, universal human psyche, both the conscious and the unconscious aspects of the psyche, that leads to, is directed towards psychological and societal well-being. This is what he means when he says that men and women are, quote, identical in essence. He uses this phrase. He says that men and women are identical in essence with God. They're identical in essence to the creative spirit or process of the divine. And sometimes Peterson speaks of God as that force or that process of upward ethical striving or development within the human psyche, that aspect of the collective human consciousness that draws us to fulfillment, that draws us to wholeness and integration. And at other times, he characterizes the divine as a pattern of co-occurring animating ideas. This is what he says on page 15. Or a kind of pattern of thought within the deep psyche. So these animating ideas are themselves referred to as a kind of living spirit within the universal human psyche. And here he explicitly endorses the Jungian notion of God as a living idea. On page 17, he talks about Carl Jung's understanding. And then here's a quote from page 29. He says, ideas are living spirits, extant both in the collective and in the individual psyche. So there you go. So God seems to be, for Peterson, the primal force or process or spirit within the collective psyche expressed through ideas or patterns of thought. And of course, Once the divine is psychologized, then it makes sense to talk about human consciousness as being involved in divine activities and in divine action, and most especially in the activity of creation. Now, when Peterson talks about creation in chapter 1, he doesn't have in mind creation ex nihilo, or creation out of nothing. It's doubtful to me whether Peterson has any room for such a notion at all. But rather, for him, creation is the act of shaping the world of conscious perception. This is creation as objectification for Peterson. It is by means of the consciousness that we confront the primal chaos to bring forth form in the spirit of Genesis chapter 1, and thereby create the intelligible structure of the world. So Peterson provides, I think, a nice summary of his psychologization of the creation account on page 32. So let me read this. He says, quote, "We cast our visions upon the water and bring into being the habitable world, good or even very good, in precise proportion to the accuracy of our aim. That is the continual manifestation within each of us of the divine word that generated the cosmos when time and space began," end quote. All right, so that's Peterson's perception of the divine in this chapter. He also has something to say about the nature of the real and about the nature of the true. Though what he says here is unsurprisingly ambiguous. So he talks about the nature of the true, or the nature of truth first in the chapter, and then later he talks about the nature of the real. But I'm going to take them in reverse order. So it becomes clear, I think, in this chapter that Peterson adheres to some form of idealism. Andrew, this is something that I think you pointed out last time. What he's proposing here seems to be a flavor of transcendental idealism. There are echoes of Immanuel Kant all over this chapter. So for Peterson, the world of our experience is given through the structure of consciousness. The objects of our conscious awareness are cognition dependent. We don't know things as they are in themselves, but only things as they appear to consciousness. And insofar as we experience reality through our perceptions, we are in that sense, we in that sense create our reality. So Peterson also seems to think that reality comes in degrees, that not all facts are equally real. He suggests that what is most real is actually the abstract structure of consciousness itself. In a lecture that I listened to from 2015, Peterson is lecturing at a university, and he asks the students, he says, "Is abstraction more real than reality?" That's kind of a silly way to put it, but nevertheless, this is what he asked the class. Is abstraction more real than reality? And his answer is yes. Abstract reality is more real than concrete reality. And he goes on to explain what he means. In this book, he talks about primal reality, or what most truly exists. And he seems to point to the locus of this primal reality, or what most truly exists, as the a priori structures of consciousness. Peterson asks a very Kantian question on page 11 in the book. He says, "Are the facts more real than the instrument that allows for the determination of the facts?" And his answer here seems to be no. They're not more real than the instrument that allows for the determination of the facts. So facts are more or less real for Peterson to the degree that they are aligned with the structure of the universal human psyche. And not surprisingly, Peterson's notion of the true is going to be greatly influenced by his notion of the real. Since reality is radically cognition dependent, truth cannot be a matter of correspondence or adequation of the intellect with the cognition independent thing in the world. Peterson's views imply a rejection of this classical definition of truth as the correspondence or the adequation of the intellect and the thing. His view just prevents him from endorsing that kind of understanding of truth. Nevertheless, there does seem to be a kind of correspondence at work here. Truth for Peterson seems to be what corresponds to the real. But recall that the real comes in degrees, and that which is most real for Peterson is the abstract structure of consciousness. So just as things are real to the degree that they align with the universal human psyche, so too are they to that same degree true. And this is why he can write on page 6 that what is most deeply necessary for our survival is the essence of truth. What is most deeply necessary for human survival, for Peterson, just is the fundamental structure of human consciousness. And this allows Peterson to speak of the truth of necessary fictions. He says that there are necessary fictions that are true. Fictions can be true for Peterson, insofar as they express that abstract, universal structure of the collective human psyche. So if you ask Peterson whether he thinks the Bible is true, he'd probably say something like, of course it's true. And then if you ask him if the Bible is a work of fiction, he'd probably say something like, of course it's fiction. Because for him, something can be both fictional and true. All right, so the last thing I'd like to comment on is how Peterson both rejects and then also assimilates certain doctrines from Freud and Nietzsche. So first off, he strongly rejects the nihilism and subjectivism of Freud and Nietzsche. Following Jung, Peterson believes in objective values and meaning. And he also seems to follow Jung in grounding objective values and meaning in the abstract structure of human consciousness. Since the universal shared human psyche provides the objective measure of both reality and truth, it also turns out to be the measure and source of objective meaning and value. Against Nietzsche and Freud, he writes on page 18, the validity of a given worldview is anything but arbitrary, he says. Instead, it is dependent on or mirrors the accuracy with which it reflects the natural, social, and psychological world, end quote. So, if you ask Peterson whether objective values are grounded in God, he would likely say yes. But for him, the divine is just an aspect of the universal structure of the human psyche. All right, so he rejects outright the nihilism and subjectivism of Freud and Nietzsche, but he also endorses some of their insights as well. However, even what he endorses from Freud and Nietzsche, he then subordinates and assimilates to the thinking of Carl Jung. So Jung reigns supreme here. Although Freud and Nietzsche, both in Peterson's assessment, they both accurately identified some of those universal aspects of the deep psyche, they come under criticism from Peterson because their focus was far too obsessively narrow, which Peterson thinks leads to their representative mischaracterizations. So he thinks Freud mischaracterized the deep psyche because he exclusively and narrowly focused on the sexual aspects of the collective unconscious. And he thinks that Nietzsche mischaracterized the deep psyche because he too narrowly focused on the will to power in the collective unconscious. So Peterson calls those aspects of the psyche identified by Freud and Nietzsche, he calls them sub-deities. Sub-deities. He says that they are the sub-deities of pleasure and power. Of course, pleasure being Freud, power being Nietzsche. And these sub-deities, he says, can possess a culture when the monotheistic unity of the collective psyche is cast aside. So the false gods, which again, when you hear God from Peterson, you should think pattern of the human psyche, That's what I would argue. That's what he means by God fundamentally. So the false gods of Freud and Nietzsche must be subjugated to the proper divine order. Again, the proper pattern of the human psyche. On page 30, Peterson writes this: what should lead, not power, that's Nietzsche, not the immature hedonistic whim of the moment, even in its strongest sexual manifestations, that's Freud, but something higher, something that genuinely brings together, establishes, names, places, and renews, something upward striving and reflective of the truth, which of course, upward striving is a phrase he uses to describe the divine. So rejecting these aspects of the psyche and subordinating them to the divine aspects of the psyche is what he calls the precondition for optimized psychological and social order alike. So very interestingly here, we see Peterson explicitly subordinating and assimilating the psychological insights of Nietzsche and Freud to that of Carl Jung. All right, Andrew, that's my take on chapter 1. So feel free to share your thoughts on chapter 1, or you can just take us right into chapter 2.
Yeah, that was an excellent summary. There's a couple of things. I don't know if there's really much I could add to it, so much as just a couple of comments I wanted to make about a few individual points. Peterson, one thing that I think a listener needs to appreciate about what you just did is that there are a whole bunch of different things that Peterson talks about, and it's very difficult sometimes to see from all of those individual things a single structure. And I thought you did a fantastic job of summarizing that there. But to now move to some of the weeds that I just kind of wanted to bring out, there are a few things that he brings into play that I think are, as you mentioned, there are doctrines that he will bring up from people like Freud and Nietzsche. There are also doctrines from traditional historical Christianity that he brings up that are quite common even. So there are things such as well, the statement that in Genesis 1, let us make man in our image, right? There's statements like that the church has kind of been all over the place on. The single most common one, though, is that there's, in some sense, the rational portion of man has been made in the image of God. Augustine, I think, is probably the most important popularizer of that notion, but a few people in particular ended up taking this and creating what we might call the microcosm, macrocosm perspective, that God would be the macrocosm, we would be microcosms of God. And Peterson, on page 5, brings this idea up again. Sorry. So Peterson brings this idea up again, and he even says that this is the definition of man. So, he's already given, as you did a great job outlining, these definitions of God. So the definition of man here is sort of as this participator in the idea, where I do believe he uses the word microcosms, but he also uses sort of like we're just the smaller photocopies of God, something like that. And so the idea, though, it has a long and venerable history. An early pope, for example, Pope Gregory I says this in the book. What is that? The book is, it's not in English, but the Latin title is Libri Moralem Siva Expositio in Librum, which would translate to roughly the moral books or exposition on the book. And so he says this roughly there in part 2, book 6, chapter 16, where it explicitly says man is a microcosm of this macrocosmic divine image. And as soon as you hear that, from a Christian perspective, traditionally sort of Christian metaphysical perspective, you're left wondering, okay, but what does that really mean? Are we saying now that we're participating in the nature of God? Because if that's the case, there's a whole lot of metaphysics that'll say things like God doesn't have a nature that leave us a little bit curious. How do we reconcile this? Well, then a little bit later in the 11th century, a major player in the academic world, Honorius of Autun, ends up echoing this in his book, The Elucidarium. And then again, 12th century, Hugh of St. Victor starts replicating this idea. He says, and this is a quote, I don't have actually the Latin for Hugh of St. Victor's, but the English translation that I have reads like this, quote, nature is the archetypal exemplar of that which exists in the divine mind. So what do we mean by nature here? Well, Hugh of St. Victor had already made clear nature here is referring to human nature. So human nature, therefore, is archetypally related to, as an archetypal exemplar of the divine mind. So then you move ahead to the 15th century. You have guys like Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who he has this book. It's De Hominis Dignitate, which I don't think is in English, but it translates to something like On Human Dignity, On the Dignity of Man, something like that. That he echoes this, and that is the dignity of man. And so in Peterson's, in Peterson's take, there are these closely related ideas. You have man as the image of God, which means then that man is also a microcosm, is to be understood conceptually as a microcosm of God, and that this is precisely where human dignity comes from, right? That this is the idea of human dignity, to be placed above creation, just as God is. And again, this is something, as I've cited here, these are some major figures in the medieval period. The later you go, right before like the Renaissance and Reformation, that idea becomes increasingly dominant. And then the Reformation happens and things somewhat change in terms of how important that image is. And in fact, the idea of treating God as or man as being made in the image of God, and by that we mean this rational archetypal participation, that becomes kind of scandalous for a little while. And so Protestantism makes that scandalous. And now that we find ourselves in the 21st century, Protestantism itself has kind of slid into now agreeing with roughly with what the Catholic Church was saying at the end of the late medieval period. I bring all that up to say, one of the things I value so much about this book is that Peterson doesn't have the concern to play the same kind of language games that pastors will have, that theologians will have, that Christian academics will have. You know, they are aware of a whole host of theological landmines that they don't want to step on, or they're aware that, you know, certain issues are far more complicated and are far more likely to arouse the ire of their peers, and so they will find ways to say things that will say what is actually verboten, but they just don't say it in the words that are verboten. And so, or they'll just say things to kind of like try to skip over the controversies and whatnot. Well, Peterson isn't plugged into these discussions in the same way. So he just comes right on out and says it. And I very much appreciate that. And in a way that kind of makes me hope that this book has a great influence on Christian discourse, if for no other reason than I like the bluntness, you know, that kind of a statement will bring, because we do need to wrestle with the idea of, well, what does it actually mean that man is made in God's image? Another interpretation, because perhaps a listener is wondering, well, what other options are there? Because the idea of us, you know, the rational soul being that which participates in the image of God is very common. But there's another pretty decently common reading, especially within the history of Protestantism, which is that the participation is actually not in the rational sense that we rationally are just sort of microcosms of God, but rather that we are made in the image of God, and by that it means that we are merely expressing his authority on earth, right? And so it's not a nature to nature comparison. It's rather we are sort of his vice regents. That doesn't require any sort of nature to nature comparison, right? So there are things like that pop up, and if it's more the vice regent kind of claim, then much of what Peterson's actually going to argue in the rest of the chapter just doesn't actually ever come to the fore ever in the text. We just wouldn't interpret the image of God in that way, right? And so that being said, though, this brings us to the question, though, of man's essence more or less being now the locus of the deity. Because this is the big question. You mentioned Hegel, or he mentions Hegel, page 14, I think it is. And there is the ultimate Hegelian goal. I think I've read this before. I don't think I read it last episode, though. But this is from the Phenomenology of Spirit, when man and God have sort of become unified again. And the question here is, all right, so if we are participating in the image of God, then doesn't this sort of imply that man made right is ultimately spiritually and therefore rationally going to look exactly like God, right? We're ultimately going to literally be expressing the same essence, because to participate in the same nature as God isn't going to imply, of course, that God has a nature. Very verboten statement in historical theology, but this would be an implication. Well, Hegel then writes straightforwardly, this is page 460 of this edition of the Phenomenology of Spirit. It's at Barnes and Nobles everywhere. So page 460, he writes, spirit is known as self-consciousness And to this self-consciousness, it is immediately revealed, for spirit is this self-consciousness itself, moving past the Hegelian verbiage. He then summarizes by saying, the divine nature is the same as the human, and I can't read this, sorry. The divine nature is the same as the human, and it is this unity that is beheld in this moment of completing self-consciousness. We start realizing the fullness and the truth of our divine essence. And that, to me, is kind of an implication of exactly where Peterson has to be going, right? When we return to Eden, when we get to chapter 2, the loss of Eden, the idea of we're seeking to return to Eden, the whole goal would actually be to order ourselves actually in this perfectly divine way, to replicate that order. The question is, though, can we even do that? Is that even something, theologically speaking, that is on the table? Now, I want to slightly move away from this, but I want that to still remain in the background for what I'm wanting to get to next. Because, let me get the book out, on page, he makes a lot of very strong statements about theological claims and about theological debates. Because this kind of gets at the idea we are to be like God. God is the sovereign who is outside and above the system. That is the goal. But then on page 10, he makes a big deal about how subdue in the Bible is not the same as to dominate. And so he also says, all claims to the contrary be damned, which is a very strong statement, because what he's referring to is Genesis 1:28, when we're given the command to go forth, subdue the earth, and take dominion over it. Well, the word there is to take dominion over it. In fact, the real word that's going to be getting kind of controversial in Genesis there is uradu, but the root is just rada, and the word there is, I mean, it means straightforwardly to dominate, right? It means straightforward. In fact, it gets used, for example, in Leviticus 25:43, commanding the ruler not to overly dominate. And then you have examples all throughout the book of First Kings, wherein we're dealing with leaders who, and this word is used to describe their behavior, they are overly domineering. And so it definitely, in the Bible, and it definitely, I would argue, in that context in Genesis 1:28, carries the connotation of domination. Like that's I don't think that's really even debatable. And so what Peterson has in mind, though, and the reason why I think he reacts so strongly against the idea of this domination, this sort of imposition of complete authority, is that, and I mentioned this in the last episode, the thing that sort of sets him on his quest, he describes it as the concern with the problem of evil. He's concerned with why do these terrible things happen? Why do we behave these ways? And the ultimate evil for him seems to be authoritarianism, totalitarianism. You know, these things, the ultimate evils of the 20th century. And so if these are the ultimate evils, and also theoretically, if this would also possibly, I would imagine in his take, be interpreted as an imbalance, right? Like an over-domineering of one force, right? That if that is the case, that would be the highest evil. And so God would not be commanding us toward any kind of thing that would look authoritarian in any capacity. And so I think that's why he's reacting that strongly. However, I don't think the language leaves us any kind of wiggle room there, because it happens again, and this is something that will actually show up in the next episode that we'll do when we talk about Cain and Abel. The same language gets used to describe Cain's fall. Sin is crouching at your door, and its desire is to dominate you, but you must dominate it. Right? The same play is happening there in the very next chapter in Genesis 4, or 3 chapters later in Genesis 4. And so this is something that is thematic even of this earlier story of Genesis. And if you, actually, one more thing about that word, I've even seen it used to describe bullying, for example, right? Like definitely a kind of strong opposition here, or strong domineering sense there. And so the point is that the language there, there's a little bit of a sense I think that we can get of Peterson importing very 20th and 21st century convictions into his reading of the text that I don't think an historically informed exegetical interpretation could actually support there. And so, as you said earlier, he's not trying to do exegesis. So perhaps that's a little bit of a wrong avenue of attack there, therefore. But I still want to make that clear that for the listener, this doesn't even necessarily hold up in terms of in terms of a genuine reading of the text, something that you can actually base any kind of true Christian faith on. Now, let me go a step further with this, because the question very much becomes, what spirit is he drawing out of the text? And I'm not going to do this whole thing where he's drawing out demons or something like that. I don't want anybody to get like the hairs on the back of their neck standing up or anything like that. I think he's got a lot of wisdom that he brings out. That being said, there's a problem of, he mentions on page 16, the idea of the zeitgeist, right? The spirit of the age. And that these spirits are spirits that really kind of possess us. But from a hermeneutic perspective, when you get possessed by a spirit in this sense, when you get possessed by an idea, by these governing spirits of the age and these governing convictions, if you will, of the age, and then you come back to an ancient text, which clearly would not have been written in the same zeitgeist, right? It clearly would not be exemplifying the same zeitgeist at all there, because it would be written literally at this point thousands of years removed from us. And then you start drawing out wisdom from it, but your wisdom is not exegetically rooted in that text, but it's rather sort of drawing out something that's pretty straightforwardly anachronistic. Then you're not drawing something that was actually in the text. You're doing what's called eisegesis. You're reading into the text what you already carried with you in terms of wisdom, and then you're getting that out of the text by just sort of, by basically just forcing that meaning onto the text. That again, there's reasons to be a little bit cautious to say that the text doesn't necessarily support these claims. Also, I forgot to say earlier, I do not know how to pronounce Hebrew. I'm self-taught on that one, so I don't. I probably butchered the pronunciations. So I apologize if anybody does speak and they're like, "What is this?" I apologize. All right. So anyway, two other things. One, I think you've already brought the quote out, but I still think it's worth stressing. We get, I think, his two things about God. One is on page 6. It's that statement that I don't think we can overemphasize enough. So repeating it here again will not be bad. It's quite possibly, if the question about Peterson is, what does he believe about God? This is the answer. This is always what we have to use to answer the question. He says at the bottom of page 6, at what point must it be admitted that a necessary fiction is true precisely in proportion to its necessity? Now, if you're going to argue that God is a necessary fiction, that he is an idea that is necessary and therefore constitutive of our own existence, it is very clear you have not argued for a transcendent God. This would still be just an idea within human consciousness. And I don't know, I brought this up last time, and I think it's still something to keep in mind. There's a difference between transcendent and transcendental. And we need to keep this distinction in mind, precisely because transcendent exceeds all human consciousness. It exceeds the human literally infinitely. And so then transcendental is just the framework of human consciousness. Now, the medievals use transcendental in a little bit of a different way. They actually are using transcendental to talk about the framework of reality, which are still going to be principles understood separately from God. But the point is, for the modern world, and I think he would be using the terms in this context, transcendent, again, would mean beyond the mind. Transcendental would still be within the mind. So if God is a transcendental principle, then he is within the mind and therefore reducible to human consciousness. If God is transcendent, then he would be beyond the mind. The problem is these two terms get confused all the time in contemporary philosophical and theological discourse. Very, very prominent figures even confuse them regularly.
And it's important to point out that Peterson himself uses the word transcendent over and over and over again. He doesn't use the word transcendental.
He does, which is why I'm saying the confusion. I'm not sure. I don't want to treat him patronizingly and say like he doesn't know what he's talking about. I very much am dead serious. You will read very reputable scholars apart from Peterson that do confuse these terms.
Well, I think what Peterson means by transcendent, I mean, we'd have to go to the particular text if we're going to be really fair to him and look at the word in the context. However, it seems to me that the word transcendent is synonymous for Peterson with universal.
Yeah.
So God is transcendent insofar as the divine is just identified with the universal structure of human consciousness. So there may not be a one-to-one correspondence, and I'm sure if Peterson were here, he'd probably tell us it's more complicated. It's more complicated than that.
Right.
But it seems to me that transcendent for him just means universal. This is something that's shared by, it transcends the individual. It's shared by all human beings.
And if we're if we're meaning that in a Kantian sense, universal would still be, within the mind. If we're meaning
and I do think that he is meaning it in a Kantian sense, because I do think it's not transcendent but transcendental, because turns out that what's transcendent and universal and shared is just the structure of the psyche. Yeah. So it structures the way we think and perceive, and it structures reality itself for us. So it's no different than the forms and categories in the mind of Kant structuring the appearances. It's the exact same notion. Now, I'm not saying that Peterson is just straightforwardly Kantian, because he's not. But I agree with you. There's a transcendentalism at work in the philosophical definition of that term, especially in its Kantian flavor. That's what's at work. And you mentioned Hegel too, and I'm not as familiar with Hegel as you are. But it seems to me that in Hegel's ontology, history itself is unfolding according to a certain telos. History itself is moving to the, you tell me what the right word is. It's moving towards a goal, to the full revelation of God within the rationality of humanity. I'm not sure that Peterson has an eschatological framework like that. I'm not sure that he would think that humanity as a whole is moving towards some state of ultimate fulfillment where the divine will be fully realized. Okay, I think he sees what's happening is that every single generation, every single individual, and every single generation, we have this task of wrestling with God. So it's not that we're moving towards a final revelation of the divine in human rationality, which seems to be Hegel's view in some sense. You tell me if I'm wrong here, but I think that for Peterson, I mean, kind of the point of his book is that you as an individual, you as a distillation of consciousness, right? You have to wrestle with God in your own psyche for this pursuit of individuation. But not just you, but society as a whole, every generation also has to wrestle with God to achieve societal wholeness, not just individual psychological wholeness. So let me put it this way. I think Peterson seems more cyclical in his thought than linear. I would understand Hegel as more of a linear thinker, and that there's a directionality towards the revealing of the divine, whereas I see Peterson as more cyclical. Yeah, he even talks about it in terms of the eternal, right? The eternal struggle. And so there's this eternal struggle. Every generation of human beings has to wrestle with God.
Well, and there's a sense in which that would be sort of, it would be Hegelian in as much as we are all moving toward what Hegel would be calling the absolute, right? That moment, that moment of fruition, that final moment. But it's cyclical in the same sense that actually I would say that Kierkegaard in our episodes on Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard ends the book with this line that every generation must relearn for itself this whole thing called faith, right? That no one generation can just learn it for themselves and then pass that on to the next generation. Everybody has to work out their own faith, their own salvation with fear and trembling. And so, I mean, it's a pretty intuitive point, because the fact of the matter is, you can't get fit for your children, right? Like, you can't pass that fitness on to your children. They can get fit for themselves, but you can't pass that fitness on for your children. You can't live a healthy lifestyle for your children, right? Every child has to do that themselves. Every human being has to do that themselves. And so there are certain things that just cannot be passed down. Yes, we can pass down books, but that doesn't mean even anybody's going to read them. So, like, the fact of the matter is everybody has to learn all of this anew from the very beginning. And this is sort of a shot in the head of the whole idea of Kant does propose this idea of enlightenment, we are not an enlightened people, he says, but we are on the way to enlightenment. We are an enlightening people, right? And so we are, as he's going to describe it, essentially, what is occurring is that we're all, as a species, in a sense, born in this moment of adolescence. He calls it an Mundukite. That's just what it really means is one without a voice. And so we're progressing into those who have a voice. And so we are progressing as a species toward something that will lose the training wheels on our bikes so that we can bike on our own without any little help. We don't have our parents pushing us along behind, making sure we're not going to fall. We lose the training wheels. We can finally be cyclists on our own, kind of deal, right? Like the point is, eventually we will no longer need these guiding Vormunder is the word that he uses, or guardians, I think is how it's usually translated. The people for whom we speak is usually the better way to think of it. We will no longer need these guiding principles, these guiders, because we're going to grow out of them, essentially. That there's this model of mankind growing up in precisely the same way a kid grows up. Well, that just gets obliterated if you take Kierkegaard's idea of we each have to relearn. We're basically starting from square one. That there's a kind of progress, this sort of intellectual knowledge kind of progress. But the problem is as well, like no one person, no generation totalizingly grasps the knowledge of the final one, right? Those kinds of linear progressive ideas are no longer really sustainable. Like the criticisms have been just too totalizingly destructive of it. But you can still take the same idea of this growing toward enlightenment and then just make each of us as microcosms individually going through that linear project now. And so it's cyclical in the sense that it repeats in each of us, but it's also linear within each of us. So I would think that's probably what's going on here. Yeah. And I can't tell you how many Christian authors I've read that say exactly the same thing. So I can't, it's not something that you can just say like, he's way off base here. But anyway, I've been bringing up enough little points of like nitpicking points of criticism, I guess, for that chapter. I guess to move into my chapter 2. We're dealing now with the fall. We're dealing now with losing the garden, but also with the constitution of Adam and Eve within the garden. So the chapter is chapter 2, Adam and Eve, pride, self-consciousness, and the fall. So we get a nice recap opening up with the image of God and him reiterating a lot of the things that he said there. And so, that discussion of the image of God was kind of fresh on my mind precisely because of my review for this chapter. But he moves from there into the ways that God creates for us. He's the one in the next section that creates the perfect order for man, that he creates man and we are made in the image of God. Then the next part of the book talks about how he puts us within this perfect moral order. He is the one that builds the walls that enframes us within this order. And then he also has some comments that he makes on Adam and Eve being sort of this perfect balance, if you will, this kind of harmony, that Adam is incomplete until Eve is made, and that Eve has this nurturing nature, Adam has this sort of conquering nature, this domesticating nature, and that together this is the totalizing ideal, right? And he even goes so far in this structure to say that Christ, when he shows up, is an exemplar of actually both the masculine and the feminine, which is probably going to be a little bit of a jarring statement at first, but I think we can maybe try to give it a little bit of a steel manning. And so he moves from there to then what, though, causes the fall? Because we're no longer in the garden. So then something causes the fall, and it's going to ultimately be pride. And this pride is going to be elevating certain pieces above the others and creating a kind of imbalance within the natural harmony that God has created, usually through the dominance of these lesser gods, these bad ideas that we must ultimately then sacrifice if we are to return to Eden. And so the end is this idea of us needing to return to Eden, which is then going to be largely constitutive of the rest of the book. So a lot goes on in this chapter. There's no way that I can actually adequately comment on all of that because that's the basic structure that he goes over. But within that structure, there are a few things that I think we do need to emphasize. So the first thing is that he kind of summarizes the last chapter with what he calls 3 propositions, right? And these 3 propositions are: the first is, quote, existence is the consequence of an eternal transcendent spirit acting upon, he says, potential itself. Probably you could even add the definite article and say the potential itself to kind of make it a little bit clearer. And so then the next quote, the next proposition that Genesis teaches us is that the habitable order that is good emerges from the workings of that spirit, end quote. And then the third one is going to be, quote, this spirit is what has proper and eternal dominion over creation, end quote. Those are on page 39. So we have these three statements about this spirit. And the fact that we participate in God, the fact that we are these microcosms of that macrocosm, I don't actually, and I do mean this as a little bit of a criticism because it's such a main theme. I don't think they actually get worked out that much in any kind of harmonious sense, because God is the one that frames the garden. He's the one that literally builds walls around the garden and eventually even builds a wall barring us from the garden by placing the cherubim there. And so God is the one that builds the walls and that establishes this order. And yet man is also a microcosm of that. But we're not supposed to build walls. Like God's determining actions, God's shaping, his creative actions are those which order the cosmos. Again, the very first of these propositions is existence is the consequence of an eternal transcendent spirit acting upon potential itself. The Thomist in me doesn't like the word, or the Aristotelian in me doesn't like the word potential being used there quite as much, because potential has a bit of a different meaning in classical philosophy than it does for Peterson. I think a better term that Aristotle would have understood here would be the word chaos, which also Peterson uses. The word chaos in Greek, and especially if we go all the way back to its Attic roots, is actually talking about, like, we could translate it as the abyss, but it's just the complete, that would think of it as a negative concept. There's a guy, Carl Carigni, who defines it as what's left of an empty egg once the shell is taken away, right? It's just this purely negative abyssal concept, right? And so God comes to the chaos, the abyss of non-being, and he into this creates order, right? That's, I think, pretty much what we're talking about happening. Now, definitely, that's an orthodox claim. How we understand God makes all the difference, though, right? And so we have this idea then of God being the one that creates this order. We as small spirits are supposed to perpetuate this creative act, right? We as these microcosms are supposed to further this, but we're supposed to further this within the boundaries set by God. Now, this leads to a couple of things here. So I want to focus on the notion of the garden. This is the subsection that goes pages 43 through 51, where he talks about the garden. And he says, we build and frame society around a moral law, and that must remain absolute and unquestioned. We do not get to touch or finagle with the moral order. This is something that frames us. We don't get to amend it. And obviously, then, God has to have some kind of difference from us if he is to be the one who establishes that to such a capacity that we cannot finagle with that moral order. And it's something, by the way, that we all recognize. I think in the opening of chapter 1, which you were talking about, he talks about the image of God as being like this principle of dignity. And we all recognize it when it's violated, right? And it offends us when it's violated, which, by the way, is the exact same thesis of...
I was literally thinking about C.S. Lewis when I was reading that.
Yep. C.S. Lewis opens up page 3 and 4 of Mere Christianity with that exact same idea of, like, imagine if we were on a trolley and somebody stole your seat. It naturally offends you. Your natural human nature has been violated. But I think Lewis kind of tellingly refers to this as the, quote, law of human nature. This isn't a divine law. This is the law of human nature here, right? And so Lewis, I do think, is a little bit guilty of the same equivocation here, though. But that being said, the point is that you can't mess with the moral order. You can't mess with the enframing laws. And he then says as well that there's a category of people that are kind of, if you will, framed outside of creation, outside of this garden. And so those are the people that live on the fringes that he talks about. These people that he kind of goes back and forth between them living on the fringes, which I would think the people that are on the fringes of a society are still within the society. But then he also kind of talks about them as if they're also those who are outside of the society trying to get in, right? So there's a little bit of an ambiguity to me on what precisely he means by these people on the margins. But he says that essentially, if we create a profound imbalance, if the people who are on the margins get moved to the center of society, because the whole of Peterson's project is largely to say, again, that we have bad narratives that are guiding us, bad framing narratives, and we need to correct the narratives by moving back to the sensible, divinely given ones, right? Well, so one of the bad narratives guiding us today is the narrative essentially of the marginalized being brought back into society. There's as the governing actors even. Pope Benedict, not Benedict XVI, no, absolutely not him. Pope Francis, in his book, I think it's Let Us Dream, it's his COVID book, opens up by a spiel even, where he ends it with, I want those who have been the marginalized to be moved to the center, so that they are the ones who tell the stories going forward. So what Peterson's saying there could even be put as a direct response to Pope Francis's statement. And there's been unquestioningly a valorization of the marginalized in American society and in Western society since at least World War II. And so this is an important point to keep in mind, because we are not to finagle with the moral order unless it fails. If the civilizational structure fails, then we can go back and reconsider the foundations again and say, all right, something we need to, right? Like something was messed up. It caused us to get here. And there's that wonderful line from No Country for Old Men that I'm probably going to butcher, but it's like, if the rule that you followed led you to this place, what good was the rule, right? So there's the idea then where we probably should now reconsider the rule, right? And Peterson does give us that allowance, right? He's not just a rigid authoritarian that anytime you find yourself within a ruled system, you must adhere to the rules. What he's talking about is that there's this transcendent, as he uses, we're probably thinking transcendental set of rules, these rules that are higher than us that we need to get back to and follow those. And so it's not to say that any humanly legislated order automatically represents those. It's rather that all of those humanly legislated framing orders, walling off orders, are participating in this higher moral order. And so it's the higher moral order that we can't question. That's, I think, important. However, practically speaking, it's impossible to keep the two separate, because every single particular legal moral order that we try to implement in society is what we think the higher natural moral order is. So every time we go back to sort of work with the particular, we are actually, in a sense, reconsidering, well, what is this higher moral order? We can posit that it exists, but every particular interpretation is indeed precisely an interpretation of that higher one, and our reaching after it. And we don't know when we've gone too far. And that's a bit of the problem, because the obvious leftist example that's going to come back to him here is going to be like, all right, so we're never supposed to take these marginalized people and move them to the center. However, are not the marginalized precisely those who will tell us when the system is broken? Are they not, in a sense, the barometer of the brokenness of the system? And if that's the case, why shouldn't we listen to them? And that more or less is the narrative of the 20th and 21st centuries in terms of sort of this progressive ideology. And I don't really see him dealing with that too much. It's really kind of presented in these broader brushstroke kind of claims. Now, this gets particularly interesting, though, when he deals with the serpent. So the serpent has a big section, and the serpent is literally equated with the marginal. He says this on page 56, right? So the serpent on page 56 is seeks to usurp God's determining power. And he says that on page 61 as well, that the serpent's trying to usurp God. So on page 57, the serpent is the marginalized, but also on page 61, the serpent seeks to usurp God. And this is again classically orthodox in terms of its Christian roots. But the claim would still be somewhat difficult to me in a kind of practical working out, right? Because again, I don't know if any consideration of the walls, right? If any reconsideration of the moral order as a practical endeavor is necessarily trying to translate it into a practical, like a lower participating moral law, then I don't know how we can ever reconsider even a failed system without, in some sense, doing what the serpent is doing here, right? And endeavoring to usurp God. Now, I say that largely not to criticize Peterson so much as to say this is me expressing what I take to be a fundamentally different theological orientation. What I'm talking about is pretty much just Protestantism. Martin Luther in his lectures on Romans calls this it's his criticism of the practical syllogism. He presents it 4 or 5 different ways in his lectures on Romans. And so there's a Protestant tradition that sort of leaves us a little bit wary of even that process, which is to say that, again, the biblical teachings here, this moral framework that the Bible is giving us, aren't necessarily meant for politics, right? There is that kind of a reticence there. But that being said, before I go too far down that rabbit hole, I do want to stress something here. There is a lot of wisdom and insight into precisely what he's saying that is also backed up by the church. If we go into Calvin's Institutes, Book 2, Chapter 1, subsection 4, he echoes Augustine's earlier statement, which is to say that pride is precisely that which causes man to fall. He says Augustine is not far from the truth, in fact, when he says that it was pride that caused us to rebel against God. And so, in that sense, you've got John Calvin there agreeing very much with that assessment of what sin practically manifests itself as. This prideful assertion of my interpretation of a moral order above the divine moral order. Practically speaking, I think that is a great definition. Also practically worked out is where there's the rub, right? Now, within that, though, we have then this notion of nakedness that he goes on about for a little while, which is really the loss of innocence when you get right down to it. It's the loss of innocence that ends up sort of aiding the narrative of us being barred from the garden. And here's where he gets to the point that I want to camp out on the most, actually, and that is how he ends the chapter. So we're barred from the garden. We have arrogantly tried to usurp God's order, the natural, proper order. We have thought that our ways, which he defines it as sort of the woman extending her nurturing boundaries even to that which should not be nurtured, right? And even to that which should be actually prohibited and kept out of the garden, that which is walled off here. And so he ends the book basically by saying that, all right, so we done screwed up, Aaron, and we need to get back to the garden. But he says, and I quote, he asks a number of questions about how to get there, and then he concludes with, what answers emerge to the questions that he's been asking? Quote, what answers emerge from the biblical corpus piecemeal, step by step? The answer is, it's all on you, with God as guide. That is an unbearable burden, although a noble burden. Certainly a challenge, possibly the ultimate challenge, possibly the secret to life and the return to paradise itself. All right. The statement, it's all on you, is italics, by the way. It says that, again, that's page 86. And when he says that, there are a number of things there that come to mind. The Old Testament presented us with a law, and that law was understood by the Pharisees, and it was understood by the religious leaders, and it was understood, I think, actually kind of rightly, as telling us this law is how you get back to favor with God, right? In a broad sense, that's true. The law is the means by which we earn favor with God in a sense. It's an incredibly qualified sense. Add the world's biggest asterisk there, because there's this other thing called the New Testament that comes along and in a very real sense reframes everything about the narrative. Now, Peterson right now has a really good series on the Daily Wire where they're going through the Gospel of Matthew, and they're doing the same thing that he does here, where he's sort of unpacking the practical wisdom of the text to guide us back to Eden, if you will. Right? But my question would be, why are there two testaments here? All right? What was missing from the Old Testament that is given to us in the New Testament? And I bring up that video series on the Daily Wire because Dennis Prager has a really great section. I think it's actually a clip on YouTube now. But Dennis Prager has a section where he says that it must be Judeo-Christianity if it is to have any sensible meaning at all. That he's all for Judeo-Christianity. If you just have Christianity stripped of any Judaism, what Dennis Prager seems to understand that to be is Christianity stripped of the law. All right? Christianity stripped of this moral code that has been given to us to guide us back to Eden. All right? And the thing is, though, again, that's why I want to ask the question, why are there two testaments? Because what is added in the Second Testament? Well, there's this guy called Jesus who's more than just the perfect balance, right, of the masculine and the feminine, as Peterson says that he is. right? And in fact, there's I might say something controversial and to say that the interpretation of Jesus as the model that we are to follow after is also something that requires another big asterisk, because I can't follow Jesus's model at all. I can't die for the sins of the world, period, right? That seems to be the singularly most important part of his narrative in the book. So if I can't follow the singularly most important, biggest part of the narrative in the book, then what am I supposed to follow when I follow Jesus, right? So there's got to be some serious qualification. And most of the New Testament is working this question out. Now, there's a bunch of people in Protestantism today called theonomists who are trying to bring back this adherence, this rigid adherence to the law. And I don't think you can do that. But what happens here is that the New Testament, essentially, if we preserve what Dennis Prager talks about, is like this, this Judeo-Christianity, what ends up becoming the case is that we just get more laws. That, the Old Testament was given to us, it gave us the law to get back to Eden, and then the New Testament gets given to us, and it just gives us more laws. But the whole point is, if I couldn't follow the law in the first place, if I couldn't actually fulfill the law in the first place, what good are more laws going to do for me, right? And, well, if you say, well, yeah, but, Jesus actually perfectly modeled what to do. Did he? Is that really how we understand him? He perfectly modeled what I'm supposed to. So dying on a cross has to be now turned into something metaphorical. We see Peterson doing this. We see that happening all the time. Take up your cross daily is taken nowadays as meaning just something like, you're going to have struggles in life, just endure them. That's kind of what it ends up being, right? But the question that I would stress is that, well, the Second Testament actually changes everything. That we actually have passages like what Paul says in Romans 7:21 through 25, where he says, I would love to do the law, but every time that I try to do the law, there's this thing called sin acting in me that prevents me from doing the law. So when I want to do that which is good, I can't. And something else takes a hold of me and makes me do that which is evil. In other words, Paul says that it is impossible to fulfill the law. He also says elsewhere that he considers all of the good works that he's ever tried as filthy rags, precisely because he recognized that they are not enough to make him be truly good before God. They're just at best saying that, hey, you didn't break these rules to further condemn yourself, right? And so then as well, Romans 10:4, we have another statement that's very important. Paul saying this to prevent us from thinking that we are the telos of the law, the word telos, of course, being the final goal, the fruition, the end of it, that which fulfills it, right? Instead of saying that we are the telos of the law, Paul in Romans 10:4 says that Christ is the telos of the law. In other words, we were never meant to fulfill it. We couldn't. Therefore, he had to show up and fulfill it for us. Now, this changes everything in terms of both what Eden is. It's not just that we've brought about some utopia, right? And furthermore, it's also not what the law is for us. The law is not some sort of a guide to get us to utopia, right? And so for Christ being the telos of the law, it quite literally takes fulfilling it out of my hands because I couldn't. Thank God for Jesus. Exactly what Paul says at the end of Romans 7. Thank God for Jesus and for what he did. Now, here's the thing. I want to say a little bit of a steel manning point I say steel manning. I want to show that what Peterson's saying here, I'm being critical of it from a Protestant perspective, but by no means is Peterson not going to have people backing him up. There's that school of thought known as the federal vision, caused a pretty big controversy a number of years ago and is resurgent now. And one of the founders of that vision is a guy by the name of James Jordan, there you go, James Jordan, right? Not the congressman, but a theologian instead. He claims to be Reformed. He claims to be Protestant. He's not. Anyway, but suffice it to say, he says the following about the law. He says, quote, on page 199 of Through New Eyes, he says, the three most common errors about the law are that it was harsh, number one, that it was impossible to obey, number two, and that it is irrelevant to us today, number three. Now, hopefully, if you're a Protestant and you hear that, your antenna go up and you're thinking, hold up, it is impossible to obey. That's precisely what Paul's communicating. So what does he say? Well, he says that first off, if you believe that it's impossible to obey, if you believe that it's too harsh, then that's probably because you are influenced by too much secularism. Now, secularism in that sense is just a cudgel that Christian apologists like to use to beat people that they disagree with, just to say it's just a cudgel to say you're wrong. So that doesn't really mean anything. But then he goes on to say something that literally kind of took my breath away when I read it. And he says, where's the line? All right. He says, and I quote on page 199, clearly, the law could be kept and was kept by many godly people. And then again, why do people think that the Mosaic law was hard to keep? In general, it is because they do not know what the law really commanded, and because they have the Mosaic law confused with the rabbinical traditions of Judaism. The rabbinical traditions were a heavy yoke. Jesus called people back to the Mosaic law, making it his own, and in so doing said that he was offering an easy yoke. Now, what is going on in that passage, right? Understanding the law wrongly is just understanding it in terms of wrong interpretations. So Jesus came along to give us the right interpretation, to get us back on track. To me, if that's the case, Jesus is needed for every generation, every age. We need another Jesus every age, because we get off track immediately, right? That would not help us in the slightest. The fact that he showed up 2,000 years ago, well, we're kind of desperately in need of another one, right? If that's the case. But this claim here is to say that the law is still there. Now, he makes a big deal about sort of this return to the temple rather than the garden, but the garden is sort of exemplified in the temple, so it's still a return to the garden. And so the Bible is then again, through the law of God here, seen as this thing that we're supposed to fulfill, and it's supposed to bring us back to the garden. And therefore, we cannot move away from the law. We are still to fulfill it. Jesus just was there to show us how better to fulfill it. Yeah. Now, there's a lot of people now that follow this. Were you about to say something?
You can go ahead and finish your thought there.
Yeah, I mean that was mostly it. I'm saying that basically, I'm bringing him up to say that Peterson is not alone, even within the Protestant tradition, with making that sort of a claim. However, once we encounter that claim, too often the lines between those two, like the law gets treated in a very vague way, I think, in contemporary Christianity, wherein we are supposed to still fulfill it, but also Jesus fulfilled it for us. So what's the point? Yeah. And so this kind of forces us to say, all right, we have to take one of two paths here.
Yeah, yeah, good. So I guess where I would differ a little bit, I agree with all of those sentiments, but I'm not sure when Peterson ends the chapter and he says, it's all on you with God as guide. I don't see him as making a theological statement there. Yeah. I think from the beginning of the chapter, he has continued what he started in chapter 1 and what he started in the foreshadowing chapter, which is this process of psychologizing the text. Yeah. So when he talks about it's all on you with God as guide, I don't think he's thinking in theological terms. I think what he's talking about here is religion as a means to individuation. Yeah. If I can go back to the Jungian term, that religion is a tool. So salvation for Peterson is also psychologized. I don't think he thinks about it in theological terms. I think salvation is the road to individuation, whereby you become a whole and integrated person. And you flourish as a human being because you are in line with that which is divine. So I resist, and I don't know if I'm doing this because this is what Peterson's doing, or because it's just my own eisegesis on Peterson's book, but I resist theological interpretations in this book because I think he's giving us psychologizations. So that's what I think he means there. I don't know that he's trying to endorse a works-based kind of salvation, although the guy you just read from the other book there clearly is. But I think that salvation for Peterson is individuation. And I think religion, and especially Christianity, is the tool. It's the tool that we need to use because it contains these archetypes that can bring to our conscious awareness aspects of the universal psyche that we can then align our lives with. And that's what he means by with God as a guide. Well, God is a guide insofar as He reveals himself. This is not a personal God. This is an abstract structure of consciousness. He reveals himself within the human psyche.
And I would agree absolutely with all of that. My one of the things I kind of probably should have made clear in the opening spiel was that we live now in the time of the phrase from Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Prison Letters is that we live in a time of religiousness Christianity, and he's wondering what that will look like, right? And so yes, the question of God has returned, but the dialectical thinker will be wondering, yeah, but under what conditions is the idea of God returning? And the point is that if the idea of God is returning in this zeitgeist, if you will, under what means is it returning? Well, it's probably going to be returning, by the way, to a notion that has colored not just the way non-believers are approaching the question, but also the way believers are approaching the question.
Sure.
And so I'm bringing up James Jordan there precisely because he absolutely believes in a transcendent God, right? Mm-hmm. He absolutely believes that Jesus died on the cross for our sins. He would be, he claims to be, I think he claims to be confessional. Pretty sure he does. The legitimacy of that claim can be contested, but he at least claims to be I think Westminster confessional. And so the point would be then, well, we live in a time of religiousness Christianity. So the question is, what does that practically speaking look like in the world? Right? That's essentially what I think we're fighting over right now. And so you turn to, there's a woman, Diana Butler Bass, has some fantastic books on this. She comes from a very sort of progressive idea of what Christianity is. And I think that's, again, because of the discourse she's in, she'll say things that a lot of more conservative evangelicals will refuse to say. And I find that to be very beneficial. You also see with Justin Brierley's book, you see the idea being that God is coming back, again, as this practical utility, in essence, for saving the West. And in fact, the idea of God being used now as the means by which we save the West. Douglas Wilson talks about this all the time with his sort of Christian nationalist theonomy. But even in a sense, you have on the other end of the spectrum guys like Russell Moore, who he still also thinks the Bible will do this. He just has a different political vision that he's arguing for, right? And the thing is, Christianity here, in all of these cases, has been reduced to a political vision, right? That's sort of like the Kierkegaardian in me is very hypersensitive to that, if for no other reason. And Kierkegaard says morality will always be the means by which the true theological core, if we think of just even in terms of a science, right? Theology is its own science. It's not a moral science. It's its own science. And so morality or moral science, or the moral science of ethics is a philosophical subdiscipline. And the tendency is to take theology, which has its own domain, and reduce it to morality. And the dominant form of theology today is political theology. Political theology builds on top of a moral system, and so it's moral theology. And so what have we done? We've reduced it to a moral system. And with that sort of zeitgeist kind of image, I see Peterson as functionally, I completely agree. The psychologizing is what he's doing. He's making explicit what everybody else is actually also doing because they already have this reduced image of Jesus. They just maintain in a kind of almost not just abstract, but arbitrary way, some traditional things like, God is beyond us and, God is the creator in some ex nihilo sense. There's just this smattering of just traditional doctrines that are now orbiting this moral psychologizing core.
Right. Yeah, and Peterson, like you said earlier, he's very much concerned about the political landscape, and it seems like he does identify tyranny as, one of the chief manifestations of the serpent, of the adversary writ large. But once again, serpent, adversary, what are we talking about there? This is just another element of the universal collective psyche that has to be rejected. So just to go back, just to make my point here with the psychologization, you started by talking about the moral order, and there does seem to be tension, at least a surface tension, between, well, wait a minute, we're in this moral order, it's inviolable, but where does it come from? Where does the structure come from? And I agree with you, there's a tension there, a tension that has to be resolved metaphysically. And by the time we get to the end of this book, maybe he will try to address the metaphysical question that in my mind is looming behind everything he says. I doubt he will, but maybe he will. I haven't read to the end of the book yet. So, but anyway, I don't think he's thinking about a moral order to which human beings have to subject themselves, as if that moral order is impressed upon us from the outside, as if it comes from a creative source, as if it comes from an external divine. Rather, the moral order is that divine aspect of the universal human consciousness. And why is it inviolable? Well, it's inviolable. He told us in chapter 1 why it's inviolable. Because it's necessary for survival.
Yeah.
That's why it's inviolable. This structure of human consciousness can't be broken, because if we break it, we break ourselves. We're done. We're gone. And so in that sense, it's if you want to thrive, if you want to continue to exist or have being in the ways that Peterson understands those words, you can't toss this off, because you will be you'll be flushing humanity down the toilet with it. So and then when you were talking about the marginal, and I completely agree with what you're saying about certain political movements that want to take the marginalized peoples and put them in the center. And perhaps Peterson has that kind of idea in mind. But when I read it, I thought about the marginal as ideas, marginal animating ideas. There's a marginal animating spirit. And these animating ideas, the spirit that exists on the margins, are sub-deities. They are representations of the adversary, the spirit that leads down. So to embrace these marginal ideas, these living ideas, is to follow, is to be on a process of downward striving towards psychological, societal dissolution, disintegration. And so I think the point Peterson's making is, in every generation, there's a tendency to, and some of us have this tendency more than others, to make that which is marginal in terms of the ideas that we have, the concepts, the way we govern, the way we live, ideas about morality, ideas about God. You take these marginal ideas, you put them in the center, and it just creates disaster. And I think one of the things I like about chapter 2, actually I enjoyed chapter 2 a lot more than I enjoyed chapter 1, and I actually think there's some insights in chapter 2 that you could as a Christian, take away some healthy insights. And one of the things I like are the insights related to, Jordan Peterson's a psychologist, that's where he's trained, so he starts to talk about the different characteristics and qualities unique to males and females. And then from there he talks about the unique temptations that we have, generally speaking, as males and females, and the kind of distortions that we could be led into if we overstep our bounds, right? If we eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, if we transgress the limits of paradise, the walled-in, fenced area, if we go beyond those, if we transgress those limits, there's a certain way, something that it looks like when females do that, or the female spirit, and there's something that it looks like when males do that. And I got to be honest with you, man, when I read that, I'm thinking, I'm reflecting on our own society right now, and thinking about the powers that be and the powers that are affecting the, let's just say, the political winds today. And I'm largely in agreement with him here. Like, wow, he's really putting his finger on these deep-seated tendencies that are unique to men and women to transgress the order that leads to fulfillment and the divine and so forth. Except, of course, I would disagree with Peterson as to the locus of the divine and the metaphysical foundation of that moral order, as would you. So anyway, it's interesting, as you're talking, I'm thinking, man, you're making some really good points too. So yeah, but and this is the way I'm probably going to be understanding this entire book, is I see it as a psychologization of the biblical stories. And I'm just kind of stuck in that way of thinking, because I'm just convinced that's what he's doing.
Yeah, and I don't think you're wrong. I think it's a very, very important, that's a great point about as well, the marginalized ideas. The one thing and I completely agree with that. One thing is, though, ideas are for him embodied in people, right? And so,
No doubt. Yeah.
yeah, and so I'm had in mind when I was reading it. There's a book by Theodore Dalrymple that he wrote, I think in like the 90s, even might have been like 95, 97, something like that. And he's a psychologist working in the UK, and he writes a book called The Life at the Bottom, and he's really exploring the psychological traits of people who live more or less in these marginalized sectors. He particularly actually is um, if you think about those who are walled off from society while still being within the walls of the garden, if you will, he's particularly talking about his encounters with people in prison, right? Which would be, I think, a perfect example of those. They're in the society, but they're literally walled off. There's a guy, Giorgio Agamben, that talks about this all the time, particularly in his series called Homo Soccer. But the thing that Dalrymple's talking about here, though, is that these people are literally embodying kind of pathology that leads them to these kinds of beliefs, actions, and formations. They would be people malformed. Now, I think Peterson would still be saying, he wouldn't be saying, keep them away from society, get them out, and so forth. I don't think he'd be saying that. I think he would be saying, because precisely of what you were pointing out there about these being ideas, he'd be saying, no, reform these people, right? Move them from from being in the grips of these marginalized ideas into good ideas that would help them to order their lives. I think that would definitely follow.
That would be the therapy that they need.
Right. And the thing is, there's another really great book. I think I've mentioned it before, called Return of the Strong Gods. And with the sub-deities idea that you were pointing out from chapter 1, you could say that we're in the grips of several weaker sub-deities, the weaker sub-deities of resentment and so forth, the weaker sub-deities of just eternal openness, which would be this mother sense that you're pointing out from, or the feminine sense from chapter 2, wherein, actually, I wrote that down in my notes. Where do I have the verse? Basically, where woman's nature is to be nurturing. And we can even find scripture to back that up, as when in Luke, I'm forgetting the chapter, he says something like, Jerusalem, how I wanted to be like a mother hen and extend my wings to you and bring you within the fold. Yeah. I'm forgetting that precise passage. So there's even biblical, though, evidence of that kind of a reading, in a sense of like God even taking on these feminine traits, and even Christ taking on these feminine traits. But the point is, though, with that kind of an imbalance, that's, oh shoot, I was looking too much and I lost my point. Right, it was going to be brilliant and profound, and everybody listening not going to hear this. We've been going for almost 2 hours now, so we're probably kind of running out of steam here. Well, yeah, we are, and so I guess I'll just summarize with these 2 points. Sorry for losing that other point, but the one is that if God is an idea, as we've sort of pretty well established on page 16 and 17, he is this necessary fiction, if you will. But the idea of growth is to say that, as he says on page 75 and 83 and 84, what we're getting at here is that God may be an idea, but he says that ultimately the sacrifice that Christians, or rather that humans are called to make, is where we let go of ideas that are harmful to us, ultimately, ideas that are holding us back. And if you look at the New Atheist's argument, the New Atheist argument was religion is destroying the world. We have religion driving people to fly planes into buildings, and religion driving Western countries to bomb them back. We have religion poisoning everything, as Christopher Hitchens put it, right? Now, we can say now that we're on the other side of that, and now we're seeing how atheism kind of seemed to poison a whole lot of things too, right? And so it's not really particularly good, but nevertheless, it's entirely possible that this kind of argument that he's giving is just the pendulum swing response to the New Atheists. It's not actually to say that we've had any kind of real substantive return, because to the truth in the kind of transcendent sense of the idea of God, it's a necessary idea. We discovered, we can't move away from it yet, right? Maybe ever, but maybe just yet. And then the last thing I wanted to say in closing for my part is that I've kind of aggregated a number of the things that Peterson has said about God. So it's totalizing, sort of the first 2 really come out of your chapter, and then the rest are from my chapter, which is that in the first one is God is the organizer of the chaos, or the potency, the potential, and that's page 2. God is the creator of a good order, and that is page 3. He is the source of value itself, page 61, but he's also the source of the value that, and the Spirit who sends value to us, the Spirit who orders it. Then you have finally that God is the Spirit who bars us from creation. That's page 75. He is the model of the masculine and the feminine in the form of Christ, which is page 55. And then he establishes, or he's the establisher of walls, which is page 43. So he's all of these things so far. This is the character of God as he is manifested.
Yeah, and that's going to be a growing list by the time we get to the end of the book. So I think what Peterson would say is, against the new atheists, is, well, the difference between my idea, my animating idea, and your animating idea is that my animating idea is necessary for human survival. It's built right into the structure of human consciousness. Your animating idea is destructive of human consciousness and human flourishing. And he would fall back on that. So I said there's a metaphysical question looming behind all of this. And that metaphysical question is, for Jordan Peterson to be able to have objective value, meaning, purpose, truth, reality, he needs to be able to anchor it in a source that is truly transcendent. And so far, from what I understand from Peterson, is the structure of consciousness of the human psyche is a matter of evolutionary development. And so we have the structure of consciousness that we have. The question for Jordan Peterson is this: why do we have it? Where does it come from? And if you ultimately can't ground it in some transcendent source that guarantees the objectivity that Peterson wants, it's not good enough to say, like Kant did, well, we have to think this way.
Yeah.
That's just the way we're all structured. We have to. That's what Kant said, right? And Peterson's making the same kind of claim. We have to embrace these necessary fictions. That's just in line with the structure of consciousness that leads to our fulfillment and well-being and flourishing. So at the end of the day, though, the metaphysical question is, but you need something else. You need something else to ground this. And what is that something else for Peterson? And I told you in the green room before we came on here, I think that Peterson is on the knife's edge right now. If he goes to the left, he ends up in a kind of pantheism. If he falls to the right, he ends up in a kind of traditional theism. But I remember in an interview that he had on Pints with Aquinas with Matt Fradd, Fradd was pushing him on his views of God and asked him if he'd ever become a Christian. And Peterson, his response was if I'm remembering correctly, his response was something like, I don't think I can. I think I'm always someone who has to embrace the ideas that are on the edge, I think is the way he put it. So in other words, he deliberately is on that edge. He doesn't want to fall to one side or the other. He doesn't want to embrace a metaphysical pantheism or metaphysical theism. He feels like it's his calling, in a sense, to be on the edge. So anyway, he needs a metaphysical commitment if we are to take him serious. That's my opinion so far. You need a metaphysical picture behind this. You need something by which to ground your ideas. If not, then, oh boy, there's a whole lot of problems that are gonna, and maybe we'll save the ultimate criticisms for the end after he's completely unpacked his ideas. So that's kind of my closing thought there. And I think that's a pretty good job covering there chapter 1 and chapter 2. So next time we will wade into chapter 3 and chapter 4.
All righty. Look forward to it.